the last thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the backend overview. So we spent a lot of time really doing a deep dive. I'm super happy with where we're at with the front end, because we have covered over the course of these lectures very deeply into all of the core technologies that the browser relies on. We talked about HTML, we talked about CSS, we talked about CSS libraries like Bootstrap, we talked about the basics of JavaScript, we talked about the data structures of JavaScript, we talked about object-oriented principles of JavaScript, we talked about the event-driven system of JavaScript, we talked about the DOM that JavaScript uses to overwrite the document object model. We talked about the standard library in JavaScript, such as the math class and the date class, the JSON class that allows us to serialize the state of our data. We looked at local storage that allows us to store data in between sessions. We looked at asynchronous JavaScript that allows us to go ahead and use promise-based implementations. And we looked at module design. I think pretty critically, that's as deep as you can get, almost. So when we look at React later on, you'll see that there's nothing that happens in React that will be unfamiliar to you, because it uses principles and concepts that pull from all these parts of the language. So we've looked at JavaScript as a general programming language. We've looked at JavaScript as a domain-specific language as it exists in the browser. So we will continue to be able to use what we've already learned about JavaScript as a general programming language, but now we're going to gear it as a domain-specific language for a web server. And so for this reason, some of these concepts will be able to cover quicker now than we did previously, because we were building up our knowledge base on JavaScript to begin with. But now we can rely on that to start to cover some of the backend concerns. So the backend summary of things that we care about, of topics we need to explore to be successful full stack developers is, well, first of all, we need to know the environment we're going to run in. So just like the browser is the environment that we run in the client side of things, it has it has the HTML parser, it has the JavaScript interpreter. Our interpreter for JavaScript at the command line, at the OS level, is Node. So that essentially is our JavaScript runtime environment that allows us to go ahead and feed JavaScript code outside of a browser's interpreter. So it's essentially an independent interpreter of JavaScript. And so the node itself, the JavaScript runtime environment, it has a Node package manager that allows us to install libraries and modules and other dependencies. So if you've used Python before, you could think of NPM similar to what pip is. So just like pip is the package manager for Python, NPM is the package manager for our Node, our JavaScript environment, our runtime environment. So we will talk about that more on Thursday. We will talk about HTTP responses from a server perspective. So we've already seen HTTP requests or HTTP communications, messages from a client perspective. Now we're going to flip to the other side and say, from the perception of a server, what is it that we need to know about HTTP? We will cover the basics of web servers. And in fact, we will build our own using Node and the standard library that Node provides. And then once we have a good understanding about what the roles and the responsibilities of web server are, after we've kind of hand-rolled a very basic one that does effectively what GitHub Pages does, kind of delivers static content, we will look at using Express to manage those responsibilities for us. And we will look at how we can enable middleware inside of Express. So we'll start looking at frameworks that can run on top of Node to make our job of building web servers and web applications or back-end web applications easier. Once we have a little bit of familiarity with Express and some of the middleware components we can implement in there, we will look at what it means to create REST endpoints so that we can start building endpoints that a front end can start communicating with. So you're now just starting to build up a concept of how to be a client for REST, how you can consume REST endpoints. Now we're going to see how we can start creating them. Then after that, we'll start getting more into the nitty-gritty of things, being able to handle sessions between a client that are repeated, so session handling, so that every time a similar client might send a request, we can maintain some kind of information. So like, for instance, giving them a cookie, for instance. We'll talk about authentication practices we could do on the web server. So being able to manage like usernames and passwords and things like that. Template engines. So we've seen a lot about how HTML files can be delivered to a client, a web client. It's not uncommon for a web server to dynamically generate HTML content. And that's exactly what template engines can do. So we'll examine some template engines that can generate dynamic HTML content that gets delivered to the web server. We'll talk about WebSockets. So it's an alternate mechanism to transmitting data between a web server and a web client. This allows for two-way continuous information. So if you want to build like a real-time multiplayer game, for instance, or maybe a chat room, WebSockets would be a good way to go. We need to talk about data persistence because that's the third tier of our full stack application, and it's technically a backend concern. So we will talk about data persistence, a data store, and in particular Mongo. And then finally, the things that we also should be concerned about is how do we deploy our web server so that it is publicly facing, just like we need to be able to deploy our web clients so that they're publicly facing. And also, we have the need to be able to test whether our software is working or not. So different testing platforms we might use will be Postman or Jest. So again, this is just to give you a understanding of where we're going in the remaining portion of the second half of this semester, of what technologies and what roles and responsibilities we'll be concerned about in order to get the back end of our web applications to work, and what technologies we'll use to do that. Are there any questions with this? Does this make sense? And again, as I said on the very first day, this is all subject to change, and I will be opinionated with what I provide content on and prioritize that which I think is most critical. Excellent, excellent. Well, again, I'm happy with the pace that I was able to keep today. I was able to get through all of my lecture slides and stay in pretty good time without going over, but not really having much time left over. Excellent. So, so I will say, as a follow-up, since I have 1 minute left, that I do have Lab 7 posted. It's due on Friday, and the companion homework for that is going to get posted probably in the next couple of days, although I give you the specifications for it in that lab document. Effectively, it's going to be a browser application that has two requirements. The first is that it makes some call to a REST API, so it's using fetches in some kind of way. And so you're welcome to even use, say, for instance, JSON bin if you want to make fetches to be able to share data between clients. That's always a easy way. And so you are welcome to refactor the application that you turned in for homework 4 that has been updated or refactored to make fetches and to utilize a module pattern, or you can make a whole new application. It's up to you. But the next homework will be to make one more browser application, but one that relies on backend services and uses this new concept that I covered today about organizing your code base into modules as opposed to a collection of scripts that have kind of global access between data. Okay, so if there's no other questions, that's it for today's lecture. I will see everybody again on Thursday. Good luck finishing the lab. If you have any questions on anything, I will be in Discord.